Have you noticed lately how toxic it is out there when it comes to the national discourse or any kind of public conversation? We just don't seem to know how to be nice to one another anymore. It doesn't matter what the differences are, whether they're religious differences or political differences, racial issues, financial issues, just no matter what, we're just yelling at each other more than anything. And that's what toxic means. It's poisonous. It's conversation that's filled with acid and hate and anger and mistrust. It's just not the way it should be. Recently, there was a story that popped up on the internet about Ellen going to a Dallas Cowboy football game with George W. Bush. They happened to be sitting next to each other, and the camera showed them sitting side by side, and a lot of progressives thought that was terrible, that she was sitting next to someone who supported traditional marriage and was considered a warmonger by the left, But she described how frustrated she was that she could be a friend with somebody who thought differently than her, and everybody would get so angry at her. It's really hard to build a bridge when things are as toxic as they are today. So, how are we going to deal with all this toxicity in our culture and in the national conversation? I think in a word, the answer is love. Jesus himself said we need to love one another as he has loved us. And as the Son of God, he is the example. He's the model for us to follow. In Matthew 5, he told us to love our neighbor as ourselves, but also to love our enemy and to do good to those who persecute you and to pray for them. Now, in theory, this makes a lot of sense. And many of us would say we believe in that. We believe in loving our neighbor and, yes, even loving our enemy. But in practice, are we really doing that? For as toxic as it is out there, I'm wondering if people of Christian faith are living out what they say they believe. Is it really an action for them? Is it from the heart that they can truly practice this idea that they love everyone, people that are different? Can an evangelical person really love and care for their Mormon friend? Can a person who believes in traditional marriage really love a person in the LGBT community and vice versa? We have to put this theory into practice. We have to learn to really love one another. And it's not easy. The best test for this is when we actually ask the people in our lives, hey, I say I love you. I tell my wife I love her. Tell my kids I love them. But ask them, does Greg act lovingly towards you? Does he show you love by the way he cares for you and treats you and speaks with you? They would probably be a better test of whether or not I believe in loving my neighbor and my enemy than my words. Ask my neighbor. And as hard as it might be to say this, ask my enemies. Do my enemies, do people who disagree with me, see me as a loving person? This is the difference. And this is the question I have to ask you. Who do you need to love in a way that is not just a theory, but an action? Because of our nature, I think it's actually easier to be toxic in our speech than it is to be kind and polite and courteous. Let me give you an example. When Robert Millett and I were doing our public dialogues way back in the beginning at Utah State, we held a public discussion. And afterwards, an evangelical person came up to me and was very angry, very upset. I could tell it from the very beginning of his conversation with me. And he was accusing me of compromising and doing a terrible job and how much he hated the evening and what a waste of time it was. And so I kind of stopped him and I said, hey, can you help me understand what you're so upset about? I realize that you didn't like it, but I don't know why you didn't like it. And I want to learn from you. If I've done something wrong, I want to learn. But he just kept being very general. Oh, it was a compromise. You didn't stand up for the faith and you were a compromiser. And I said, well, help me out. Did I fail to stand up for true biblical historic Christian orthodoxy as I believe? I mean, did you feel like compromise there? He said, well, no, to be honest with you, you're pretty good. You know your stuff. So it wasn't really that you weren't
orthodox in what you said, but it was all the other stuff. And I said, well, what was the other stuff? And he said, well, it was just your compromise. And I said, no, help me to be more specific. Did I fail to make the distinctions between my faith as a historic Christian and my professor friend's faith as a Latter-day Saint? Was the distinction compromised? Did I fail to stand up for the differences? He said, no, I think you did that as well. And finally, I just said, I don't understand what you're so upset about. And in frustration, he told me, the deal is that you were just way too nice to the guy. And I paused there and I said, I'm not sure that's my issue. That might be your issue. You see, he wanted me to hate my Mormon friend, and I was trying to love him. Yeah, we can talk about those differences, but we don't have to hate one another. Let me give you one last example from a great theologian, Dr. C.S. Lewis, whose writings are very well known. But he wrote this in 1949 in a book called The Screwtape Letters. Uncle Wormwood, the senior demon, is writing to his nephew demon about some of the challenges of dealing with one of their patients, a human being that they want to deceive. And this is what C.S. Lewis writes in the voice of a demon to another demon to try to corrupt humanity. Listen and see if these words don't apply to our own time right here in 2019. My dear Wormwood, be sure that the patient remains completely fixated on politics, arguments, political gossip, and obsessing on the faults of people that they have never met as an excellent distraction from advancing in personal virtue, character, and the things that the patient can control. Make sure that the patient is in constant state of angst, frustration, and general disdain towards the rest of the human race, in order to avoid any kind of charity or inner peace from further developing. Ensure that the patient continues to believe that the problem is out there in the broken system, rather than recognizing that the problem is with himself. Keep up the good work, Uncle Screwtape. Toxic speech is killing us, and we've got to change our ways.